What is that you're seeing? What do you see? In case you're confused about my question, I'm reading this scientific paper about consciousness and neuroscience, written in 1998 by these two scientists who are Francis Crick and Christopher Koch. Christopher Koch. The main premise of this paper was that science is the correct way to approach the topic of consciousness, not religion nor philosophy. They are taking a very close look into consciousness in an attempt to understand it. I'm currently reading the segment that is called The Nature of Visual Representation. We have argued elsewhere, as this paper, I don't want to go back and look for it, that to be aware of an object or event, the brain has to construct a multi-level, explicit symbolic representation of part of the visual scene. By multi-level, we mean in physiological terms different levels, such as those that correspond, for example, to lines or eyes or faces. In neurological terms, we mean loosely the different levels in the visual hierarchy. I am pretty confused right now. How is it that things like lines, eyes, and faces are considered as within the physiological terms? Also, what are the different levels of the visual hierarchy? And unfortunately, I do not think that the internet can answer my question regarding the connection between lines, eyes, and faces with physiology, but I'm going to assume that they are linked with physiology because we develop special physiological interest, physiological intense reaction to eyes and faces, but still that does not click with lines. But I think that when it comes to lines and even eyes and faces, they mean that shapes that signal for us, oh, that shape is the shape of an eye, and that shape is the shape of a straight line, and that shape is the shape of a face, etc. So moving on, when it comes to the visual hierarchy though, the internet did help me quite a lot actually. Turns out that this is a concept used by a lot of designers, and I managed to develop a rough idea about this concept. So, someone designed something visual, say a restaurant menu or a website. The designer predicts where your eyes are going to land on first, so they make sure that the design fits perfectly with your eyes' movements. In addition, it's not just that where your eyes land on, it is what your eyes will focus on first as well. Like, will you notice the text or the background first? Or the color of the text first, or maybe the shape of the text itself first. For example, there is a concept called the F pattern. It is used to demonstrate the movement of the eyes when it is reading a website that contains a lengthy article. And there is the concept of the Z pattern. It is used with design pieces that are light in text like infographics. Okay, now we know what do they mean by multi-level representation. Let's see what do they mean by explicit representation. The important idea is that the representation should be explicit. We have had some difficulty getting this across. By an explicit representation, we mean a smallish group of news which employ coarse coding, as it is called, to represent some aspects of the visual scene. Okay, so like by explicit representation, they mean when a few number of neurons work together to make a part of the visual view of the whole view in front of your eyes be coherent for the receiving end, that is your conscious brain processing the visuals coming from eyes. I hope that's not too complicated. I believe in the next sentence they are going to provide an example for the sake of clarification. Buckle up, the next one is pretty heavy. In the case of a particular face, all of these neurons can fire on somewhat face-like objects. We postulate that one set of such neurons is all of one type, say one type of paramedical cell in one particular layer or sub-layer of cortex. Okay, well, probably be fairly close together and will all project to roughly the same place. For all such groups of neurons, there may be several of them stacked one above the other. If all such groups of neurons were destroyed, then the person would not see a face, though he or she might be able to see the parts of the face, such as the eyes, the nose, the mouth, etc. There may be other places in the brain that explicitly present other aspects of a face, such as motion the face is expressive. I like this segment a lot. It contains some interesting information and it is quite straightforward. Notice that while the information needed to represent a face is contained in the firing of the ganglion cells in the retina, there is, in our terms, no explicit representation of the face there. Now, you might ask, what is the ganglion cells? I found this Wikipedia page explaining what a ganglion cell is, and as I understand, it is a type of a nerve cell. However, I decided to go beyond Wikipedia though, but not going too deep. The dictionary, saved the day, and it's just now clear for me. It is just a group of nerve cells found outside of the brain, and the spinal cord. Anyways, back to the segment I was reading. This segment is weird. On one hand, it is saying a face is contained in the firing of the ganglion. On the other hand, it is saying there is no explicit representation of the face there. Maybe the key is in our terms, quote unquote. But what is their terms? I will proceed reading in the hope that the upcoming segment might clear up some things. How many neurons are there likely to be in such a group? This is not yet known, but we would guess that the number of to represent one aspect is likely to be closer to 10 to the power of 2, meaning like 1000, to 10 to the power of 3, meaning like 10,000. So they're estimating from 1000 neurocells to 10,000 neurocells that are all working together for the sake of one element of the whole visual scene in front of you. So maybe there are 5,000 cells working together dedicated only for you just to see one pixel of the screen in front of you. Well, not one pixel, but you get the idea. A representation of an object or an event will usually consist of representations of many of the relevant aspects of it, and these are likely to be distributed to some degree for different parts of the visual system. How these different representations are bound together is known as the binding system, or the binding problem. Okay, nothing new here except for the new term, the binding problem. Much neural activity is usually needed for the brain to construct a representation. Most of this probably unconscious. It may prove useful to consider this unconscious activity as the computations needed to find the best interpretation, while the interpretation itself may be considered to be the result of these computations, only some of which are then conscious of. The gist of the segment is that we are not aware of all the efforts our neurons are doing to make this visual representation manifest in front of us very coherently. Cool, I guess. Next, let's go to the next segment. As a working hypothesis, we have assumed that only some types of specific neurons will express the NCC. Now, the NCC is the minimum amount of efforts that a neuron can possibly do to make a certain task function in your brain. Don't know why though it is mentioned here, but anyways, let's move on. It's already known that the firing of many cortical cells does not closely correspond to what the animal is currently seeing. An alternative possibility is that the NCC is necessarily global. Now, what do they mean by the term global? Do they mean that the NCC phenomena can be seen in all creatures across the board? Or do they mean is that for a particular species, or for us humans, it's always the case that our neurons are working on a minimum amount of power that is necessary to function. In one extreme from this would mean that at one time or another, any neuron in cortex or associated structures could express the NCC. Okay, after the sentence, I think they mean any part of the brain, any neuron in the brain can sometimes consume the minimum amount of energy to function. At this point, we feel it's more fruitful to explore the simpler hypothesis that only particular types of neurons express the NCC and not any type, before pursuing the more global hypothesis. Yeah, you see, that's where they use the same term again, global, and I think they mean the whole or the general hypothesis. So they have two hypotheses right now. They have the more specific hypothesis, and then they have the general hypothesis. The specific hypothesis say some neurons express the NCC, while the general hypothesis say all neurons sometimes express the NCC. And the two scientists say it's better to approach the specific hypothesis first and then go to the general hypothesis, because they think the specific hypothesis is a lot more simpler and easier to deal with. It would be a pity to miss the simpler one if it were true. As a rough analogy, consider a typical mammalian cell. The way its complex behavior is controlled and influenced by its genetics could be considered to be largely global, but its genetics instructions are localized and coded in a relatively straightforward manner. The analogy is quite weird and confusing, not gonna lie. This was the end of the segment, the nature of visual representation. The segment was about how the brain is trying to create multi-level and explicit symbolic representation of the visual scene. Now, we have two concepts that are multi-level and explicit. Multi-level meaning that the different elements of the visual scene in front of you. Explicit meaning that each group of the neurons work together to form a visual representation in your mind for a singular particular element of the visual scene. And then all these different groups in your neural cortex form all these elements together to form the whole visual scene in front of you. Now, into the next segment. Where is the visual representation? The conscious visual representation is likely to be distributed over more than one area of the cerebral cortex, and possibly over certain subcortical structures as well. By the way, this is the cerebral cortex, this whole pinkish thing in your head. So the visual representation is distributed among all the areas, this pinkish thing that is called cerebral cortex, and even some visual tasks are delivered to places that are under this pinkish thing that is called the cerebral cortex. I've argued that in primates, contrary to most received opinion, it is not located in the cortical area V1. So that's a pretty bold claim, since this area that is called V1 is literally called the primary visual cortex. Some of the experimental evidence in support of this hypothesis is outlined below. This is not to say by any means that what goes in the V1 is not important, and indeed may be crucial for some forms of vivid visual awareness. Okay, so they are not denying the total role of the V1 in seeing. However, they do not think that it is the vital core visual translator to our consciousness. What we suggest is that the neural activities there is not directly correlated with what is to be seen at the moment. So like you can't base on, like study the activities in that area of the brain and then see what this creature is seeing at the moment, and then draw some conclusion based on some correlation between those two elements, the thing that is in front of the creature that is seeing and the activities in the V1. Hope that's clear. We have also wondered whether the visual representation is largely confined in certain neuron lower cortex layers, such as layer 5, layer 6, which are the deepest layer in the cortex jungle. So this hypothesis is still very speculative. They are not sure about it yet. Now that we have discussed the nature of the visual representation and the location of the visual representation in the mind, in the brain, it's time to talk about what is essential for the visual representation. Now that will be in the next video. Bye.